Good evening and welcome. Tonight we journey back to a moment when the fate of nations hung by the thinnest of threads. A time when the grandest empire the world had ever known, an empire that had dominated global affairs for centuries, found itself in an unthinkable predicament. We often recount tales of wartime heroism, of battles won and enemies vanquished. But beneath the thunder of cannons and the roar of fighter planes, another, far more silent and insidious war was being waged. A war not for territory, but for solvency. Not with bullets, but with balance sheets. Imagine a colossal entity, a titan of history, facing its ultimate test. The year is 1940. Europe is ablaze. London burns under relentless bombing, and the very idea of Western civilization trembles on the brink of collapse. From the outside, the British Empire still projected an image of unyielding power, a vast swath of pink dominating world maps. Yet, within its heart, a terrifying secret was taking hold, a secret whispered only in the highest echelons of power. An empire that once commanded a quarter of the globe was not just fighting for survival, it was bleeding to death financially. This isn't just a story of a world war, it's the untold narrative of how an empire, through sheer desperation and an unyielding will to survive, was systematically dismantled, not by conquest, but by economic necessity. It's about the agonizing choices made in dimly lit war rooms, the desperate pleas, and the brutal negotiations that would forever alter the global landscape. We'll explore how allies became unforgiving creditors, how historic assets were stripped away, and how the very foundations of imperial power were sacrificed on the altar of immediate survival. This is the story of the unseen cost of victory. The price paid when a nation wins the war on the battlefield but loses its future in the ledger. Prepare to see World War II through a lens you may never have considered before, a story of financial ruin, desperate gambits, and the profound, lasting legacy of economic sacrifice. The twilight of an empire begins now. Civilization. Therefore, the United States should offer Britain a gift, a grant of $6 billion, not a loan, but a retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had expended holding the line. He called it justice. But upon his arrival in Washington, he discovered that justice was not a currency the Americans recognized. The mood had shifted. The war was over. The American public was weary of funding Europe. Politicians in Congress harbored deep suspicion of Britain's new Labour government, recently elected on a platform of socialism and nationalizing industries. They had no desire to use American capitalist tax dollars to fund a British socialist experiment. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were unyielding. They met Keynes with cold eyes, informing him bluntly there would be no gift, no grant, only a loan, and it would be on commercial terms, with interest. Keynes was devastated. He argued, he pleaded, he warned that crushing Britain financially, they would destroy a vital ally against the rising threat of the Soviet Union. But the Americans held all the cards. They knew Britain had nowhere else to turn. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive, and it came with strings attached, strings designed to strangle the last vestiges of the British Empire's economic independence. The most insidious condition was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within a year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. This meant that anyone in the world holding British pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for US dollars. The Americans framed this as free trade, claiming they wanted to open up global markets. In reality, it was a calculated move to break the sterling area. During the war, Britain had compelled its colonies and trading partners to accept payments in pounds, but had forbidden them from exchanging those pounds for dollars. This forced countries into a trading bloc. In the chilling grip of December 1940, The very fabric of Western civilization teetered on the brink. While the roar of the Battle of Britain had faded from the skies, the relentless blitz tore through the streets below. London smoldered, and industrial titans like Coventry and Liverpool buckled under the Luftwaffe's hammer. The British Empire, a vast pink stain across a quarter of the globe, projected an image of invincible power. Yet within the clandestine war rooms of Whitehall, a grim truth was whispered among those in power, a secret too terrifying to share with the public. The empire wasn't just losing soldiers, it was hemorrhaging financially, bleeding towards ruin. From his subterranean command post, Winston Churchill, the resonant voice galvanizing the free world, penned a letter destined to become one of his life's most crucial. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Churchill, a master of rhetoric, now faced a humiliating task: to convey to the leader of the wealthiest neutral nation that Great Britain, once the world's banker, its industrial engine, the power that humbled Napoleon, was, beyond all doubt, utterly and completely bankrupt. The letter was a meticulous account of the strategic peril, the U-boat menace in the Atlantic, the urgent plea for destroyers and aircraft. But its true impact lay in the revelation that Britain's treasury was nearing depletion, unable to sustain the colossal war effort. Churchill articulated that while the British people would indeed fight on the beaches, they could not fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. It was a raw, desperate cry for survival, an admission of utter insolvency. To grasp how the grandest empire in history arrived at such destitution, we must delve into the brutal economics of total war. When conflict erupted in September 1939, Britain remained a financial giant. It boasted billions in gold reserves, a sprawling portfolio of overseas investments, from Argentine railways to Chilean copper mines, and vast American industrial holdings. London stood as the undisputed nexus of global insurance and shipping. However, Hitler's war was unlike any preceding it. This was a war of unprecedented industrial consumption, devouring steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at rates that shattered pre-war projections. Crucially, Britain depended on imports for almost everything. The blockade of Europe forced its gaze westward, across the Atlantic, to the United States for its very lifeline. At this juncture, the United States maintained official neutrality. The American public, scarred by the First World War's European trenches, was fiercely isolationist. Congressional neutrality acts were designed to keep America out, specifically via the cash and carry clause. This mandated that belligerent nations, like Britain, could purchase American supplies only with immediate cash payment, transported on their own vessels. No loans, no credit. Americans were willing to sell the instruments of war, but only with gold in hand before the cargo left New York docks. For the war's initial year, Britain systematically drained its wealth to meet these demands. Gold reserves were liquidated. In a clandestine undertaking dubbed Operation Fish, the nation's entire gold wealth was ferried across the perilous Atlantic on battleships and liners, spirited away to Canadian vaults. It was the largest transfer of physical wealth ever recorded. Billions in gold bars and securities dispatched to satisfy American creditors. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The liquid capital vanished. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington found itself with stacks of unsigned contracts for planes and tanks, as London's Treasury officials declared there were no dollars left to honor them. Upon receiving Churchill's letter, Roosevelt understood the gravity of the situation. He recognized that Britain's fall would inevitably drag the United States into the abyss. Yet he faced a formidable political hurdle. Direct monetary aid was illegal under American law, and public outrage would be immense. He needed a solution that appeared as a shrewd business transaction, not a charitable handout.
He needed to sell the war effort to the American taxpayer. This necessity birthed the concept of Lend-Lease. Roosevelt presented it to the press with a folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is ablaze, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. You lend it, and he returns it when the fire is out. It sounded simple, generous, a neighborly gesture. Yet the reality of the closed-door negotiations in Washington was far removed from this idyllic image. It wasn't a friendly chat, it was a ruthless foreclosure between a bank and a bankrupt client. Henry Morgenthau Jr., the American Treasury Secretary, led these dealings. A staunch anti-fascist, he genuinely sought to aid Britain against Hitler. However, he was also the vigilant guardian of the American taxpayer. He insisted that before the United States extended a single dime, Britain must demonstrate it had exhausted every last asset. He suspected hidden wealth and demanded a comprehensive audit of the British Empire, a full inventory of every asset, both governmental and privately owned by British citizens worldwide. He wanted to know the value of every shell casing, every woolen sock, every share of stock. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were aghast. They were being compelled to expose their entire financial ledger to a foreign power, treated not as a wartime ally, but as a failing corporation in receivership. Phillips protested, explaining the gold had already been sold, arguing that liquidating long-term investments mid-war would be a disastrous fire sale, yielding mere pennies on the dollar. He warned that stripping Britain of its overseas income would condemn the nation to destitution after the war, unable to feed its populace or rebuild its shattered cities. Morgenthau remained unyielding. His directives from the president were unequivocal. No aid would be forthcoming until Britain had scraped the bottom of the barrel. The logic was brutal. If Britain still possessed assets in the United States, why should the American taxpayer subsidize their war? Why should an Iowa farmer pay for a British tank if a British lord still owned a factory in New Jersey? The most poignant symbol of this forced liquidation was the American Viscose Corporation, a colossal industrial entity. American Viscose was the largest producer of rayon and artificial silk in the U.S., a profitable jewel in the crown of British overseas investment, owned by the British company Courtaulds. Its millions in annual dividends flowed back to London, bolstering Britain's trade balance. Morgenthau singled out American Viscose. He informed negotiators it had to be sold, its proceeds deposited directly into the U.S. Treasury to offset existing weapon orders. The British resisted, knowing the company's true worth exceeded $100 million. A rushed wartime sale would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau held the ultimate leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was navigating Congress, facing attacks from isolationists who claimed Britain was wealthy and attempting to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed a clear demonstration of Britain's financial distress. He delivered an ultimatum: sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease will die in committee. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, under immense pressure from Washington, the British government forcibly seized the American Viscose Corporation from Courtaulds without asking permission. It was a compulsory purchase order enacted under emergency war powers. The sale was managed by American investment bankers who, aware of Britain's desperate need to sell, drove a merciless bargain. The company was sold for approximately $54 million, a clear undervaluation. The British government was forced to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds back in London, increasing its internal debt, while the dollars from the sale flowed directly into the U.S. Treasury, paying for rifles and aircraft engines. The sale of American Viscose marked a turning point, revealing to the British elite the true cost of the special relationship. They were not equal partners, but a subordinate entity, stripped of assets to secure their survival. The United States was absorbing the wealth of the British Empire, not through conquest, but through contract. Yet this liquidation wasn't confined to industrial assets. It extended to the geopolitical bedrock of the empire itself. While financial negotiators haggled over stock prices, another deal was struck concerning the Royal Navy. Britain desperately needed destroyers. German U-boats were decimating merchant shipping faster than British yards could build replacements, threatening to sever the vital lifeline to North America. Churchill implored Roosevelt for 50 aging destroyers, World War I-era vessels, dusting away in American naval yards, obsolete and of little value to the modern U.S. Navy. Roosevelt agreed, but not for free. He offered a trade. In exchange for 50 rusty ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a chain of British naval and air bases spanning the Atlantic.
As 1941 bled into 1942 and the United States officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the power dynamics shifted again. Britain and America now fought side by side. American soldiers poured into Britain, transforming the island into an immense aircraft carrier for the U.S. Army Air Force. Yet the financial disparity only widened. American industry, supercharged by government spending, exploded in size and efficiency, with the U.S. economy growing exponentially each year. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was utterly consumed and distorted by the war effort. Britain ceased exporting, converting every factory to war production, abandoning its markets in Latin America and Asia. And who stepped into those vacant markets? American companies. While British factories churned out Spitfires, American factories produced Spitfires alongside refrigerators, radios, and cars for the global market. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously capturing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer of wealth was complete. The world's gold reserves had migrated from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had decisively shifted across the Atlantic. But the ultimate humiliation was still to come. The British believed their sacrifice would be honored, that having fought alone against Hitler for 2 years and bankrupted themselves to save the world, the Americans would treat them with generosity after the war. They anticipated a continued Lend-Lease during a transition period, a soft landing. They were gravely mistaken. They had forgotten the harsh lesson of the viscose sale. In the realm of high finance, gratitude holds no currency. The moment the war ended, the bill would be due, and the shock of that reckoning would shatter what little remained of British power. The story of the price of victory is a stark lesson. A nation can win a war militarily, yet lose it economically. Britain had defeated Germany, but in doing so, it had paradoxically defeated itself. It had mortgaged its past to secure its present, selling its future to its ally in the process. On August 15, 1945, news flashed across the globe. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. In London, jubilant crowds swarmed Buckingham Palace, chanting for the king. Bonfires blazed. Strangers embraced in the streets. It was a moment of unadulterated joy. The tyranny of the Axis powers was crushed. The British Empire had stood alone against the darkness and had prevailed. Yet, across the Atlantic, in Washington, D.C., there was no sentimentality. Only a cold, bureaucratic machine poised to shift gears at this precise moment. 7 days after the victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a document that would devastate the British economy more profoundly than any German bomb. He signed the order to terminate Lend-Lease. The cutoff was brutal and instantaneous. All aid ceased immediately. There was no transition, no grace period. Mid-Atlantic, American Liberty ships laden with wheat, meat, and tools bound for Liverpool were abruptly ordered to turn around and return to the United States. The lifeline was severed. The British government was paralyzed by shock.
They had assumed aid would continue, supporting their monumental rebuilding effort. They had believed their economy, utterly warped by the common war effort, would be given time to readjust to peace. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist and government advisor, gazed at the figures and saw an abyss. Britain imported half its food and almost all its raw materials, paid for by Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt, not in a year or a month, but instantly. Keynes calculated that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. The country would have to default on its payments, cease food imports. Wartime rations, already meager, would plummet to starvation levels. Industries would grind to a halt without raw materials. Mass unemployment and social collapse loomed. There was only one option left. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes embarked on a ship for Washington. He was ill, exhausted, his heart condition rapidly worsening. The greatest economic mind of the century was journeying to America, not as an intellectual, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he held a moral high ground. He intended to argue at the U.S. Treasury that Britain had fought the war for 2 solitary years, while America remained neutral. He would contend that Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to save Western civilization.